Do you believe that someone can kill for love? We're not talking about an unresolved teenage crush or temporary jealousy. We are talking about a real, premeditated crime, with every detail coldly described, as if it were part of a story written by four hands. Now imagine, he didn't just kill, he wrote everything, every emotion, every step, every decision. And in the end, in front of the authorities, he stated with the coldness of someone telling an obvious secret, "She taught me everything." What makes a person go beyond the limits of sanity for someone? Would it be obsession, emotional dependence, or something even deeper? A type of blind surrender where reality is distorted and right and wrong become confused? This story is not just about a murder. It's about manipulation, desire, power, and how, sometimes, love can be the most effective. Mask for horror. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever found yourself involved with someone who seemed to control even your most intimate thoughts? Who claimed to love, but made love a minefield of guilt, promises, and dangerous silences? Maybe you never got as far as this case, but stay with me until the end. Because what you discover now may surprise you, and maybe make you see relationships in a new light. The records are real. There are pages and pages of a diary where he details everything, from his first meeting with her to the exact moment of the crime. And the most disturbing, the way he writes, as if he was proud, as if I were living a great tragic love story, the kind that has been made into a movie. On some pages, excerpts like, "She said she would only truly love me if I proved I was capable of anything for her." In others, short, cold sentences, like a death sentence. "Today, I kept my promise." It's impossible not to wonder, was he a victim or an accomplice? Crazy or in love? And she, was it just a trigger or the real mind behind it all? Headlines at the time featured words like crime of passion, romance fatal, murder inspired by love. But the truth, or what comes closest to it, is much more complex and disturbing. This story goes beyond what one can imagine. It forces us to face questions that we avoid in everyday life. How far would you go for love? Can you recognize the signs of a toxic relationship before it consumes everything around you? And most importantly, do we really know who is next to us? Get ready, because from now on, we're going to dive into a case that defies not only logic, but also our very notion of affection and madness. And what comes next could change the way you view love forever. And perhaps the most disturbing thing of all is realizing how this story passes through us, even if from a distance. Because deep down, we have all experienced some type of overly intense surrender. We have confused passion with possession, or we have silenced warning signs in the name of a love that, in reality, was just control in disguise. And that is precisely why this case is not just about they. He speaks with us. With every person who has ever given too much, who has ever believed in promises that seemed more like traps, or who has ever been afraid to say, enough. If this topic makes sense to you, leave here in the comments what has touched you most so far. It could be an opinion, a doubt, or even a personal experience that you want to share. This space is safe, and your report can help other people who may be experiencing something similar and have not yet been able to name what they feel. And if this type of content provokes reflection, captures you and makes you want to know more, already like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with messages that really matter. Every like, every subscription, every comment, all of this strengthens our community and helps us to continue bringing stories that deserve to be told. With depth, responsibility, and above all, with empathy. Because what comes next goes even deeper. Let's open the diary, page by page, word for word, and maybe, just maybe, you too will see something of yourself in these lines that are as dark as they are revealing. He was one of those who would go unnoticed in a crowd. Neither beautiful nor ugly, neither expansive nor too shy. A common face, an apparently serene look, a controlled posture. One of those people that we look at but don't retain. I worked in a small company in the administrative sector. I led a life without major events, without scandals, without stories. His colleagues described him as polite, a little reserved but kind. It didn't attract attention. It was as if he was trying hard to appear just like that, invisible. But behind this warm appearance there was something silent, accumulating day by day. A hunger for connection, for intensity, for being viewed. And when she appeared, everything changed. She was the opposite in everything. Strong, magnetic, those people who take up space with their own presence. He had a confident, provocative, almost hypnotic manner. It didn't fit the standards. It was intense in words, gestures, choices. She carried a beauty that was not obvious, but that caught the eye, and above all, she knew it. He had stories to tell, and more than that, he knew how to tell them. He is silent. She, full of sound. Him, searching for meaning. She, creating narratives. When they met, it seemed like the beginning of any modern relationship. An exchange of glances, a conversation too long to be casual, late-night messages, confessions disguised as a joke. But there was something different about that connection, something that escaped common logic. It wasn't love at first sight. It was more like a game and therefore a symbiosis. She had command of the word. He, the thirst for approval. She needed to be followed, admired, obeyed. He wanted to belong, to be chosen, to be worthy of that love that seemed as big as it was unpredictable. His closest friends began to notice subtle changes. He no longer made as many decisions on his own. His tastes began to align with hers, his opinions, his vocabulary. Everything around her seemed to fascinate him, or consume it, and that wouldn't be a problem if the relationship was healthy. But there was a hidden truth behind the scenes of this romance. Behind the apparently perfect dinners, the smiling photos, the affectionate nicknames, there was an unstable ground made of manipulation disguised as affection, small loyalty tests, subtle pressures that over time became explicit demands. Phrases like, "If you really love me, you will do." This began to emerge. At the same time, she surrounded him with promises of an exclusive, passionate, grand future. It was as if he was being molded for a role that only she could see, and he accepted it, with a commitment that mixed love, desperation, and submission. He started writing, first as a way to vent, afterwards as an attempt to understand what he was experiencing. But soon the words took on a different tone. They began to document, not just feelings but events, dialogues, instructions, as if the diary was a kind of silent script, which he followed in secret. And she read, corrected, encouraged. "You write better when you're angry," he was quoted as saying once. Anger became fuel, and love, a justification. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what was revealed there was not just an intense relationship. It was a silent transformation of identity, a journey of internal erasure, where he no longer knew who he was outside of it. What seemed like love was actually control, a dangerous psychological dance where she led each step and he believed he was choosing. It didn't happen overnight. The line was slowly being crossed. One decision at a time, a mentality that was being shaped until he no longer recognized the difference between desire and obedience. And the most disturbing thing is that, on the outside, everything remained the same. They went to the movies, had dinner out, posted smiling, photos. Outsiders said they were in love. An intense couple, some said, but no one saw what happened after the door closed. The cutting words said in jest, the tests, the silences, the emotional threats, the revelations he wrote down on paper, like someone trying not to go crazy, but also as someone who was already getting used to the madness. That's why stories like this touch us so much, because often what hurts doesn't scream. It infiltrates slowly like an idea, a suggestion, a guilt, and when we realize it, we are already trapped in a narrative that seems impossible to get out of, an invisible prison with windows painted with affection. That's why it's so important to talk about it. Name things, recognize the signs, and understand that true love does not cancel us. It expands us. It doesn't test us. It welcomes us. Write it in the comments. Have you ever been in a relationship where you were no longer yourself? Or if you prefer, type, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is within the diary that we begin to understand what was not seen on the outside. The pages, all written by hand, with slanted handwriting and meticulous spacing, reveal a world that seemed to exist only between the two of them. An intimate, almost ritualistic pact, where reality and delirium mix in a disconcerting way. With each line, what was nebulous begins to take shape, but not in a comforting way. It's a gradual, disturbing descent into the mindset of someone who has lost his sense of right, convinced that what he was doing was somehow justified by love. In one of the first entries he writes, "At first I thought she loved me for who I was. Then I realized she loved me for who I could be, as long as I learned to obey. And soon after, almost as if he was answering himself, she taught me how to erase someone's soul with a smile." This phrase alone already has a frightening impact, but when placed within the context of that relationship, it becomes a key, because this is no longer a common case of emotional manipulation. It is a systematic process of deconstruction, a game of psychological control where every seemingly innocent gesture hid a deeper intention. Elsewhere, he describes a specific night. "She asked me to look her in the eyes and repeat that I would do anything. I said yes, not because I wanted to her, but because not saying yes would be losing her. And losing her was like losing the only reason to keep breathing." What draws the most attention in these reports is not just what he says, but the way he says it. There is a tone of blind devotion, of absolute surrender, as if all that mattered was pleasing her, following her, constantly proving something. He was no longer a person with his own desires. He was a mirror of what she wanted him to be. This type of relationship, when taken to the extreme, creates its own logic. A logic where abuse is disguised as proof of love, where pain is resignified as sacrifice, and where the blame starts to reside with those who suffer, not with those who hurt. It is a silent and cruel reversal. And when this happens long enough, a person stops trusting their own perceptions. You begin to doubt your own memory, your own feelings. "She said I was only scared because I was still weak." That fear was a veil, and that true love lived on the other side. The way he narrated the events was almost poetic. There was beauty in the form, but horror in the content, like someone trying to delicately write their own destruction. He spoke of blood as if he were talking about redemption, of pain like someone describing a sacred ritual. "Today she held my hand and said, 'You are ready.' I smiled, and I understood that from then on there was no turning back." It's difficult to read something like this without wondering, to what extent can one mind be shaped by another? Where does individual responsibility end and the power of influence of those who manipulate begin? Psychology calls this emotional fusion, when two individuals lose boundaries between themselves and start to operate almost as a single entity, only unbalanced. One dominates, the other goes out. And it is in this erasure that the most radical decisions are born, because there are no more filters. There is no clear conscience anymore, just the need to please, not to disappoint, to follow the script, even if that script involves crossing irreversible boundaries. He no longer saw himself as someone capable of acting on his own. On one of the last pages he wrote, "She said that there was no true love without final proof, that to love is to have the courage to go all the way. I did. And now, for the first time, I feel like I belong to her completely." This phrase carries more than confession. It carries the hidden truth of a relationship where everything was given new meaning until there was nothing left of what it once was. And the scary thing is that, reading these words, you can see that he believed it in truth. There was no regret. There was relief. There was pride. That's why this diary is more than a record. It is a dark mirror of a journey of emotional destruction, a kind of involuntary manual for the mind that surrenders to other people's delusions convinced that love needs extremes to exist. It's not just a crime. It is the consequence of a profound internal transformation, built day after day, word after word, to the point where the murder itself stops seeming like an act of violence and becomes, for him, a kind of mission accomplished. Comment. There. That makes sense to me. Or tell me, have you ever met someone who seemed to dominate people with sweet words and promises of unconditional love? What happens when the fantasy of love turns into blind obedience? When does the desire to be accepted become confused with the desire to disappear? The answer begins to emerge precisely when their relationship reaches a turning point, that silent but definitive moment where passion not only consumes but also corrupts. The connection that previously seemed intense, full of dedication and complicity, begins to exude something denser, something dark. And there, in this gap between emotional dependence and affective delirium, the first irreversible decision is born: to kill. But nothing happened abruptly. This transformation was thorough, almost invisible to the eyes of those just observing from the outside. He remained the same silent, gentle, discreet man. But inside, something was being stitched together, day after day, with strategically chosen words, calculated gestures, and silences that spoke more than any scream. He was vulnerable, yes, but not in the most obvious sense. I was vulnerable because I wanted to belong, because she carried an emptiness that she seemed to know exactly how to fill. She, on the other hand, knew it, and he used this power like someone handling a blade, with precision. The relationship became a silent game of emotional submission. She offered validation whenever he met her expectations, and she withdrew her affection with the same coldness whenever he hesitated. And it is in this type of dynamic that the mentality begins to shape itself. Little by little, he stopped questioning. He began to accept everything as part of a path that he needed walk to fully deserve it, even something that, for anyone else, would be unthinkable. In one of the most disturbing excerpts from the diary, he writes, "She talked about what courage was. She said that real courage isn't dying for someone, it's killing for someone, and that if I really loved, I needed to prove it." The phrase has weight, it has impact, and it has a hidden truth that cannot be ignored, because it wasn't just a suggestion. It was an emotional provocation made by someone who knew exactly where to touch to manipulate. And he, no longer able to distinguish his own limits, took that as a calling, like a mission, as the only way to show that he was worthy of that love that both consumed and nourished. She was seductive, but not in the traditional sense. It wasn't about appearance, it was about presence. He knew how to dominate spaces with few words. He made others revolve around him without even realizing that they were being pulled. And he, at the center of this emotional vortex, confused dominance with devotion. The truth is that he no longer made decisions, he just followed instructions disguised as promises. You need to understand that this is bigger than us. It's about transformation, about breaking free from the rules that limit true love, she reportedly said in one of the conversations he also recorded. The first murder happened like this, as a test. A sickening test, but coated with an almost spiritual discourse. He chose the victim as if carrying out a ritual, with no apparent emotion, just conviction. In his own words, "It was quick. It was clean." She said that now I was hers completely, that I finally understood what it was to love without limits. What makes it even more disturbing is that to him, it didn't seem like a crime, it was a landmark, a baptism, a symbol of belonging. And here we need to look behind the scenes of this decision, because when we talk about manipulation at deep levels, we are talking about someone's ability to invade another's mind and rewrite the meaning of everything. Right, wrong, pain, freedom. We are talking about a psychological journey that dismantles someone's internal structure until all that remains is the echo of the voice of those who dominate. And that's what makes this case so impactful. It's not just about the act of killing. It's about the path that led to it. A path made of micro decisions, small silences, conditional validations, and an emotional dependence built with patience and strategy. Many people ask, was he just a puppet in her hands? Or did you carry within yourself an impulse that just found the right trigger in it? The answer may not be simple. What is certain is that this story shows how much a mentality can be shaped when the need for acceptance overrides the instinct for preservation. He didn't act on impulse, acted for schedule, and she knew it. He knew so much that he never needed to send it, just suggest it. A smile, a subtle phrase, an absence of affection at the right moment, and he did the rest. The line between victim and accomplice at this point in the story begins to blur, and the scariest thing is realizing how for him it all made sense. Each step was part of a narrative built with emotional promises and lies that seemed like absolute truths. And the more he delved into this illusion, the further he became from any possibility of return. Tell me something in the comments. Have you ever felt like you were doing things just to not lose someone? Or right there, I've been trapped in that logic. This story still has layers that need to be revealed. When we look at this type of case through the lens of criminal psychology, everything takes on an even more disturbing tone. Because, as much as the story may seem absurd or far from most people's reality, it carries real psychological traits, studied and documented in similar cases around the world. According to criminology experts, what happened between him and her can be classified within a rare but deeply impactful phenomenon, the madness for two, or madness for two. It's an uncomfortable question, I know, but necessary, because it makes us think about the limits of emotional influence. Where does the power of those who manipulate end, and the responsibility of those who accept being manipulated begin? And, more, did he want to resist in his suit? Or did you gladly indulge in the idea of being guided by it because it freed you from the burden of making decisions on your own? After all, living in someone's shadow can also be an escape. An escape from fear, insecurity, guilt. It may be easier to obey than to face your conscience. When we returned to his words in the diary, she showed me who I really was. It is clear that he did not see himself as a pawn. On the contrary, he saw himself as someone who had been awakened, as if she had just removed the mask the world placed over him, revealing his true nature. This brings us to another unsettling point. What if she didn't create it but just revealed it? If everything he was already carrying was asleep, waiting for someone to say, "Go, it's allowed." Psychology calls this moral authorization. When someone, usually a figure of power or admiration, validates what was previously considered wrong, and in doing so, you offer the other person emotional permission to cross boundaries. From then on, what was unacceptable starts to be defended as necessary, how fair, as part of a personal journey. And this is, perhaps, the most dangerous facet of influence. It does not force, she convinces. During the trial, the defense tried to explore exactly this point. They argued that he was just a fragile, emotionally unstable young man, captured by a dominant, almost hypnotic figure. The prosecution responded firmly. It showed evidence that he acted with full awareness, that he planned, chose, and hid it, and that on many occasions he took initiative without even consulting his partner, which points to an even darker truth. Perhaps he used her likeness as a shield, as an emotional alibi to hide a will of his own that he knew the world would never accept. So we return to the central question. Was he manipulated or manipulative? Maybe it was a little of both. Perhaps their relationship was the perfect and dangerous combination of two profiles that complemented each other in the dark. One needed to dominate. The other needed to let himself be dominated. And in the midst of it, lives were lost, not only physically, but also emotionally, because the marks that this type of dynamic leaves go far beyond the headlines. And perhaps the most important thing about this reflection is understanding how these patterns are not restricted to extreme cases. The logic of influence, whether subtle or explicit, is present in human relationships all the time. The way we shape ourselves, how we let ourselves be led, how we give up parts of ourselves in the name of something that seems bigger. This can happen anywhere, in a relationship, in a friendship, in a work environment. Now tell me, have you ever experienced a situation in which you realized you were repeating choices that weren't really yours? Comment there. I've seen myself in that mirror. When we look at this type of destructive relationship that hides under the label of love, it is impossible to ignore that this pattern has already been repeated, and more times than we would like to imagine. There is a kind of dark script that runs through some of the most disturbing stories in modern criminology. Two individuals who alone might never cross certain limits, but who together create a kind of ecosystem of violence where one enhances the other to the point of no return. This perverse dynamic in which a couple shares not only affections but also destructive impulses has a name and precedence, and the scary thing is that it's not as rare as it seems. Just remember Bonnie and Clyde, the young faces, the rebellious romance, the myth of two fugitives in love against the system. But behind the romantic narrative built over the years, there was a raw reality. Armed robberies, homicides, and a trajectory of crimes that left a trail of blood wherever they went. Bonnie Parker, who was a poet and dreamed of an extraordinary life, found in Clyde Barrow not only a partner in life, but a partner in crime. And the two got lost in a plot where love and violence went hand in hand. An interesting detail: they have become cultural icons, almost like underworld celebrities, which shows how dangerously thin the line between fascination and repulsion can be. Another emblematic case, and even more disturbing, is that of Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo. Here there is no trace of romanticization. What you see is pure brutality. Paul was known as the Scarborough rapist, even before Karla entered the story, but it was with her that he pushed the limits of horror. Together they kidnapped, tortured, and murdered teenagers, including Karla's own sister. And the hardest thing to accept, many of the actions were recorded on video, proving not only Karla's active participation, but also how emotionally involved she seemed with the crimes. And when it all came to a head, what did she do? She claimed to have been manipulated by Paul and convinced the system. She struck a deal, got a reduced sentence, and only after the recordings emerged did it become clear that she was not a victim. She was an accomplice, full, cold, aware. The pattern is repeated in different corners of the world. Couples who, when they meet, awaken the darkest in each other. Some call this folie à deux, a rare psychiatric disorder in which two individuals share delusions and psychotic behaviors. But it's not always so clinical. Sometimes it's a matter of mentality, a combination of neediness, blind admiration, emotional emptiness, and thirst for power that, when merged, produce extreme decisions. Revelations that only happen when the masks fall and the hidden truth imposes itself. This type of symbiosis between two distorted profiles turns the relationship into an inverted moral bubble, where right and wrong lose meaning. The two begin to live in their own logic, where limits are redrawn by their own hands. And the most worrying thing is that this can start out routinely, a complicit look, a conversation in which a fantasy is confessed, a shared secret, and suddenly, what should sound absurd starts to make sense between them. This is the key to shared perversity. The other validates what the entire world would condemn. According to criminal psychology scholars, this type of partnership does not depend solely on psychopathic traits. Often, it involves apparently normal people who find in others permission to release what has always been there, repressed. There is a profound impact when someone says, "I understand you. I would do the same." This is more than distorted empathy. It's complicity. And in many cases, this is exactly what starts a spiral of violence. It's no coincidence that so many couple crime cases have this almost theatrical atmosphere. It's as if they live in an alternative history where they are the misunderstood protagonists and the rest of the world, the villains. They create a plot of their own, an internal narrative where everything is justifiable. This is one of the most uncomfortable revelations that criminology brings. Evil, when shared, can seem less burdensome to those who practice it. and more dangerous for those nearby. And make no mistake, this is not restricted to the big names in news. There are hundreds of lesser-known cases spread around the world that follow this same structure. Couples who, together, committed atrocities that they would never have committed alone. Ordinary people, with an apparently normal history, who are transformed by a poorly constructed emotional bond. And once again, we are faced with this uncomfortable idea. Transformation is not always for the better. Sometimes it reveals what a person would spend their life hiding if they hadn't found someone who said, "Go, I'm with you." This type of relationship forces us to rethink the concept of partnership. Because after all, being with someone is a journey of mutual influence. The way you see the world, make decisions, interpret your own feelings, all of this can change depending on who walks beside you. And when this influence is unhealthy, when it is based on domination, fear, or obsession, the effects can be catastrophic. Not just for the couple, but for everyone around them. These cases alert us to the behind the scenes of human behavior. They show that love, when distorted, can become a trap, a justification for everything, and that the hidden truth behind certain relationships only appears when the consequences become impossible to hide. Now tell me something. Do you believe that a relationship can, in fact, turn someone towards evil? This case forces us to face an uncomfortable reality. Relationships that start out like any other can turn into something devastating. What seemed like an ordinary relationship, where two individuals attract each other, get to know each other, and perhaps even dream together, can over time become corrupted by destructive dynamics and, in extreme cases, culminate in tragedy. In the beginning, no one imagines that this type of relationship, where passion or complicity can be confused with true love, would escalate to such a point of violence. But the truth is that the line between affection and destruction is often thinner than we would like to believe. When a person becomes so absorbed by another, whether through emotional dependence, seduction, or even direct manipulation, it is possible for the dynamic to become unhealthy and warning signs to be ignored. And this is exactly what can happen when we fail to notice the first manifestations of control, excessive jealousy, or possessive behaviors. These symptoms, often subtle at first, are the basis of a toxic relationship. In the case of relationships where emotional manipulation takes place, the impact spreads silently. It's as if the other were a drug, an addictive substance, where coexistence and moments of pleasure become increasingly rare, but more intense and unpredictable. Dependence in this sense takes the place of genuine affection. The victims of these dynamics end up losing themselves, losing their sense of identity, while the manipulator continues to shape the reality around them. But the scariest thing of all is that these signs can hide at the very beginning, camouflaged by a facade of normality. It is not uncommon that, in the early stages of a relationship, psychological manipulation is subtle, such as excessive praise that quickly turns into control over the other person's clothing, friends, or even professional choices. Over time, this manipulation intensifies. In the case of some more extreme relationships, the partner begins to control even the other's mental and emotional behavior, creating a scenario of isolation and submission, where the victim begins to believe that everything the partner does is, in fact, out of love. This is one of the most serious issues, the transformation of love into a weapon of control. Psychological violence, with its invisible nature, can be as harmful as physical violence. When one partner tries to mold the other to their own will, nullifying individuality and making the person feel incapable of making decisions without the other's approval, the relationship enters a vicious cycle of domination. Victims become dependent on the approval of others and often do not even realize how this process occurs until it is too late. This is where reflection needs to happen. How can we identify these signs before they turn into something irreversible? How can we learn to recognize controlling behavior before it destroys someone's self-esteem and emotional independence? The truth is that the signs are, yes, present. Open communication, mutual respect, and the freedom to be who we are, without fear of judgment or disapproval, are the pillars that support any healthy relationship. When these pillars begin to weaken, we need to stop and question, what is happening here? And most importantly, if you find yourself in a relationship where manipulation begins to take hold, it is essential to seek help, whether through therapy, support from friends or family who can act as a point of support. This case also shows us the importance of emotional education. If we better understand how our own feelings and reactions work, we can be better prepared to identify unhealthy patterns in a relationship. The key is learning to recognize what is true love and what is manipulation disguised as affection. This type of knowledge is not something we learn immediately, but it is something we can develop over time and with practice, through constant self-analysis and the search for a more balanced emotional life. Furthermore, it is essential that people, as a society, develop greater empathy and active listening in interpersonal relationships. Often, the signs that something is not going well are invisible, because victims are immersed in the cycle of manipulation and fear. Or in other situations, the fear of reporting or seeking help can be a huge obstacle. It is crucial that we learn to create a supportive environment where others know they can count on us and feel safe to open their hearts without fear of being judged. What can be learned from this, then? That relationships, no matter how perfect they seem at first glance, can hide very dark sides. When respect and freedom of being are undermined, the relationship can turn into an emotional prison, where the manipulator exercises absolute power over the victim. And even though this process is gradual, the consequences can be devastating, often irremediable. Now, with this in mind, a reflection is necessary. To what extent should the responsibility of those who influence be considered? If one person manipulates another, leading them to commit unthinkable or even criminal acts, what is the line that defines each person's responsibility in this process? Psychology offers us tools to understand the dynamics of toxic relationships, but the truth is that each case is unique, and the motivations behind each act can be complex. However, responsibility cannot be transferred completely to someone else. Ultimately, we are responsible for our choices, even when we are involved in a dynamic of control or manipulation. Comment there. To what extent can another person's influence justify our actions? The case we explore today is, without a doubt, one of the most complex and tragic situations we can try to understand. A story where love, or at least what was believed to be love, turns into a kind of destructive force. He, moments before being executed, said that everything he did was for her, and that I would do it all again. This raises a powerful and distressing question. How far can love, or what is understood as love, take a person to commit such an extreme act? What really is love when, in the end, it turns out to be something so dark and deadly? Now, as we reflect on these final words, there is something we cannot help but consider. Human relationships are profoundly influenced by many factors. The way we connect with others, how we let ourselves be shaped by emotions, and above all, how we see the role of the other person in our lives, can have much deeper implications than we imagine. When the line between love and obsession begins to blur, it is possible that what once seemed like genuine affection turns into something much darker, where the other is no longer seen as someone with their own desires and freedom, but as an extension of oneself, someone who must be kept under control at any cost. However, the question that arises here is whether he was really telling the truth, or was he just desperately trying to justify his actions? We know that emotions can mix with rationalization, and that in moments of great pressure, people try to find a way to make their mistakes more understandable, even to themselves. The issue is complex and requires deep reflection on human motivations and the impact of our choices. But perhaps the most poignant question is, how far does the responsibility of those who influence go? Can we really blame someone for what someone else decides to do, especially when that other person was manipulated, or led to believe that their actions were justifiable? Or, in fact, do choices made at critical moments belong solely to those who make them, regardless of the circumstances surrounding them? This question is not limited to extreme cases such as the one we are discussing, but can be a valid reflection for any type of power dynamics in relationships. When someone feels that love or the desire to please another person justifies any action, what is really at stake is the balance between free will and external influence. Each of us has a responsibility to recognize when we are crossing a dangerous line, when what seemed like an expression of affection turns into something harmful. But what about the victims of this manipulation? Do they also have the power to resist, or are they often so lost in their own emotions that they can't see reality clearly? The questions multiply, and perhaps none of them have a simple or definitive answer. What we know, however, is that this is a topic that deserves to be explored in more depth, because it touches not only on the psychology of crime, but on the dynamics of power, love, and manipulation that are present in many relationships around us, even if we don't have the courage to see it. The truth about this case, like so many others, lies somewhere between manipulation and trying to justify extreme actions. But in the end, what remains for all of us is the lesson that we must be attentive to the signs, the dynamics, the transformations that can happen around us, and most importantly, how these changes can affect the choices of those we love. So I ask you, do you believe that someone can really kill under the influence of love? Or was it just a final excuse, an attempt to escape his own guilt? Comment. What do you think? How far can love influence our actions? This case, like so many others we have investigated, leads us to question the deepest layers of human nature. Along this journey, we have been challenged to understand not only what drives a person to commit a crime, but how emotions and external influences can intertwine in such complex ways that it is difficult to distinguish what is truly genuine and what has been manipulated. In many situations, people find themselves trapped in relationships that appear to be based on affection, but in reality are a fertile field for emotional and psychological manipulation. What was once a desire for love and connection can become dangerous terrain, where extreme choices are seen as justifiable or even necessary. The big question then is, how can we identify these signs before it's too late? How can we distinguish true love from disguised obsession? And most importantly, how responsible are we for our actions, especially when we are influenced by those we love? These moral and psychological dilemmas are not exclusive to extreme cases like this. They are present in some way in many of the power and control dynamics we see around us every day. And this is exactly the key to reflection, understanding where limits are crossed, both for good and for bad. This journey is about more than just understanding the criminal mind. It's about reflecting on the psychology of human relationships and how they can evolve into something destructive. When someone begins to justify their actions based on deep feelings, the line between what is acceptable and what is devastating can become very thin. And once again, the question that persists is, to what extent is the other person to blame? Where does personal responsibility begin, and where does the influence of those around you end? The truth is, the answers are often unclear, and that's what makes these cases so fascinating, but also deeply disturbing. Throughout this content, we have seen how the impact of relationships, whether through manipulation or unhealthy influence, can alter a person's perception of reality. And this leads us to an important reflection. What else could be behind this dynamic? What else besides love could have led someone to surpass the limits of reason and morality? These are questions that help us better understand what happens behind the scenes of the human mind, especially when emotions are involved. Now, as we delve deeper and deeper into these mysteries of the human psyche, it's interesting to note how each story brings to light universal questions about the choices we make, the relationships we cultivate, and the effects those decisions have on the lives around us. And in a way, this type of reflection is an invitation to look more closely at the relationships in our own lives and perhaps identify the warning signs before something irreversible happens. So, I ask you, once again, do you believe that someone can really kill under the influence of love? Or was it simply a desperate attempt to justify irremediable action? I want to know what you think about this. Comment. Does this make sense to me? If you've made it this far, it's because this subject really touched something inside you. This type of reflection on the complexities of the human mind and relationships makes us question many things, doesn't it? Sometimes we need to take that step back, observe what is happening around us, and understand how the dynamics of power, affection, and control can be much deeper than we imagine. If this content made sense to you, connected with something you've already thought or felt, leave a comment saying what you think. Can we really be influenced in such an extreme way by love? Or is there something else at play? I want to know your opinion. Let's talk more about it. And if you like this analysis, leave a like too. It helps me bring more content like this, always with this unique view of the human mind. Oh, there's a video here that will continue this reflection. So click there and we'll continue on this journey together. See you soon.